Hello, and welcome to the final episode of the Portsmouth Institute's Easter Virtual Retreat, Crisis Converted, a Benedictine Guide to Hope. I'm Father Augustine. Well, the end is near, as they say, and that's particularly easy to feel right now with this coronavirus on our doorstep. If you spend a moment or two on the internet, it's not long before you come across some prophet of doom who sees this as a sign of the end of the ages. And of course it is. There will be powerful earthquakes, famines, and plagues from place to place, and awesome sights and mighty signs will come from the sky, or so we're told. Other folks claim that this is divine retribution for one or another of society's great evils. And of course it is. Sin came into the world through one man, and his sin brought death with it. Even if all these things weren't happening, who of us plans to be here in 100 years? This is why monks wear black, to remind ourselves, in the words of Saint Benedict, to keep death daily before our eyes. Now, the mark of a Christian, wrote St. Augustine, is to watch daily and hourly, and to stand prepared in that state of total responsiveness, pleasing to God, knowing that the Lord will come at an hour that he does not expect. This is the mark of a Christian. And yet, I'll bet very few of us, when we woke up this morning, seriously considered the possibility that the world might end today. Even after hearing this reading, it's hard to imagine that the world might actually end anytime soon. But I know a group of people who really do think like that, and they aren't cultists or crazy folk. They live in Creve Coeur, Missouri, at the Town and Country Home for the Elderly. I say Mass out there every month, and these folks at the Town and Country Home, they consider it a real possibility that their world will come to a sudden and immediate end. I said Mass there not long ago, actually, and since most of them sleep through my homilies anyway, I like to really do the whole hellfire and brimstone thing. In fact, the louder and more animated I get, the more they seem to enjoy it, so I really sock it to them. And for their part, they tend to take what I say with a sizable grain of salt. So I was on a real roll, and I said, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Who knows, any one of you could be dead tomorrow. And Marion, who sits in the front row, she wakes up just long enough to say, heck, I expected to be dead 3 weeks ago. And I thought to myself, now I understand why Jesus had such a soft spot for the poor, because they get it. They're that much closer to death than the rest of us, and they realize, whether they like it or not, that each day is a gift. And because they know it, it's not hard for them to see the urgency of Christ's message. With this virus going around, we've all had a bit of a wake-up call. Death, it seems, is a little more real all of a sudden, a little closer. And that's a sobering thought, but it's also mysteriously a comfort. I remember a few years ago, I walked past old Father Luke's cell. He had chosen a room that overlooked the graveyard, and he was gazing out the open window at the spot where, in a few months, he would be buried. And Father Luke was my novice master and the founding abbot of my monastery here in Saint Louis. I liked the old guy, and I owed him a lot, so it concerned me to see him in such a state. I said, "Good morning, Father Luke." And he awoke from his meditation and smiled at me, and he said, "Good morning, Father Augustine, how are you?" I said, "Fine, how are you?" He said, "Well, you know me, I'm just waiting to die." Well, this didn't sound like Father Luke, so I leaned further into his room and asked him if he was okay. He said, "Me? Oh, I'm about as happy as anyone can be, but you got to have something to look forward to." I spent a few days walking around the monastery, a little befuddled and in a bit of a funk. But then it occurred to me, there's really no other way to get to heaven. And this is why Saint Benedict told his monks that they must keep their death daily before their eyes. You see, every monastery is a sort of microcosm of the greater church. There are as many different kinds of monks as there are Christians. There are fat monks and skinny monks and hardworking monks and lazy monks and stupid monks and smart monks. And every monastery I've ever visited had one crazy monk. At Saint Louis Abbey, our crazy monk was Brother Edward Dahlheimer. And by crazy, I mean that he had invisible animals in his room that talked to him. He was also, I think, what they call obsessive compulsive. His utensils had to be perfectly parallel on each side before he would begin breakfast. After he died, we found that every item in his cell, every lamp, every framed photograph, every table and chair was glued in place. I, by contrast, am not, whatever the opposite of obsessive compulsive is, that's me. Nothing in my life is in its place. If the calefactory is a mess, the abbot asked me to clean it up because it was almost certainly my doing. And my brethren have taken to calling me the late Father Augustine because my novice master once remarked, that monk never leaves a room once. Brother Edward was forced, in addition to all this, to sit next to me in choir for 11 years. Side by side, 7 times a day, for 11 years, we chanted the Psalms together. I remember walking past his cell one afternoon when I spotted a really old copy of Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises on his shelf. I asked him if I could look at it. He answered, Father Augustine, that is an autographed first edition. It will be a cold day in hell before I lend you that book. He stopped then for a moment and closed his eyes as if in prayer. He said, in fact, it will be a cold day in hell before I lend you anything at all of any value whatsoever. So that was that. A few years later, the abbot decided to send me to Oxford to study theology. I may be distractible, but I'm smart. And I applied and was accepted. So to celebrate and to thank the community for their patience, I prepared a festive meal, the crowning achievement of which was a chocolate walnut tort that my mother had taught me to make. I did this partly with Brother Edward in mind because I knew he liked his desserts, but I also did it with myself in mind because I like walnuts. But I did something slightly unmonkish. I made an extra tort for myself, which I cut into small pieces and froze. And one larger slice I wrapped in aluminum foil and hid in the refrigerator behind the mayonnaise. And the next morning, after we'd finished our morning prayers, I made myself a big cup of coffee and found a good book and a comfortable chair next to a sunny window in our library. Then I went to the refrigerator to collect my slice of tort. But when I unwrapped it, I discovered that someone had got to it first. In fact, had taken a bite out of my chocolate tort. I could see the teeth marks in it. Had wrapped it back up exactly as he had found it and returned it to the refrigerator in exactly the same place. I cannot describe for you the depths of rage that I felt at that moment, contemplating my violated, half-eaten, slobbered-on slice of chocolate walnut tort. And there was no doubt in my mind who had done it. This work of scrupulous insensitivity had Brother Edward written all over it. Even now my pulse raises. So I went back to the kitchen and I cut another slice of tort and wrapped it in the foil just like the first one, placed it in exactly the same place in the refrigerator. But first I soaked it in Leon Pepper's super hot Cajun sauce. And the next morning, after prayers, I returned to the kitchen, and there was a half-chewed chocolate tort sprayed all over the floor, over the refrigerator, on the wall. It was arguably the greatest moment in my life. And a few weeks later, I left for Oxford. And Brother Edward didn't even say goodbye. But while I was away at Oxford, I received an email from the abbot informing me that Brother Edward had gotten very sick. It had nothing to do with his chocolate tort. He had cancer of some sort. And then I began to wonder if it really was the greatest moment of my life. And about a month later, when I was told that Brother Edward had died, I was pretty sure it wasn't the greatest moment of my life. Anyhow, to make a long story a little longer, when I returned to the monastery, finally, after getting my degrees, I came back to my cell and was unpacking when I noticed on the coffee table next to my bed, there was a little brown paper package cut out of a brown grocery bag. The paper was taped very carefully with Scotch tape and tied with twine. And so I sat down and cut the twine and opened the brown paper, and it was Brother Edward's copy of The Sun Also Rises. And it was then that I learned why this is so important to Saint Benedict, that we keep death always before our eyes. Not only is heaven something to look forward to, but the thought that you or anyone could be dead within the next few days or the next few years is sobering, and it tends to put things in perspective. These little things that become so huge when you live together with someone in these confined spaces. Well, this coronavirus has really upended our lives, hasn't it? No one is quite sure what the effect will have on the economy. And then, of course, there are the lost lives. But if it brings out the Benedictine in all of us, if perhaps we grow more comfortable with the language of silence, a little more aware of our mortality, if we find more substantive sources of stability in our lives, and maybe greater sympathy for the people we live with, and use this as an occasion for conversion to a life of increasing holiness, well then, maybe some good will come of it. In the meantime, I will be praying for you. The monks of Saint Louis Abbey will be praying for you. The monks of Portsmouth Abbey will be praying for you. Pray for us, and may we all meet again someday in heaven. God bless.